My father once told me I was a mistake, carved from the wrong piece of wood. At the time, I thought it was just another insult, one of his cruel ways to remind me I'd never fit his world. But now looking back, I realize it might have been the only truth he ever told me. My name is Samuel Whitaker. I'm 42, and I fix broken furniture for a living. Chairs, clocks, cabinets, things most people throw away. My workshop sits on a quiet corner of Charleston, South Carolina, where the smell of varnish and old wood mixes with sea salt drifting from the harbor. When I open the doors each morning, the light cuts through floating dust like smoke in a church. This place is my sanctuary, where silence hums and time slows enough for me to remember who I am, or who I thought I was. Because for most of my life, I believed I was the only son of Richard Whitaker, one of Charleston's most powerful real estate magnates, a man who could turn empty lots into empires. To everyone else, he's a legend. To me, he's a storm that never stops judging. Richard doesn't visit my shop. He doesn't understand how a Whitaker could choose sawdust over skyscrapers. He used to say, "You're polishing ghosts, Sam. There's no profit in sentiment." I'd laugh pretending it didn't sting. But when your father measures worth in dollars, love starts to feel like a loan you'll never repay. People tell me I look like him, the same sharp jaw, the same gray eyes, but I've always seen something different in the mirror. Softer. Foreign. Like a copy made by someone who never saw the original. Every evening after the last nail is set, and the last plank gleams with oil, I walk home past the mansions my father built. Their white columns glow under the street lamps, like a row of perfect teeth smiling at a world I'll never belong to. Behind one of those doors, he hosts parties full of senators, bankers, and the kind of people who say legacy like it's a sacred word. My name never comes up. Still, I keep trying. I keep restoring what's broken, hoping maybe he'll notice the beauty in what can be saved. Because that's what I do, breathe life into things others gave up on. But the truth is, lately, I've started to hear his old words echo in my head again. A mistake carved from the wrong piece of wood. What if he wasn't just being cruel? What if he knew something I didn't? Because deep down, beneath the noise of the workshop, beneath the hum of sanders and saws, there's a question I can't silence anymore. What if the man who raised me wasn't my father at all? The question, what if he was never my father, followed me everywhere that week, like the faint hum of a broken clock you can't shut off. But on the night of his 75th birthday, I told myself to silence it. Maybe I thought if I showed up, if I brought him something made by my hands, he'd finally see me. Foolish hope maybe, but hope nonetheless. The Whitaker celebration was held at the Seaside Grand Hotel, a place where the chandeliers looked heavy enough to crush you if you stared too long. I arrived early, carrying a box wrapped in dark green paper, the same color as the ocean after a storm. Inside was the grandfather clock I'd spent 3 months restoring, a family heirloom that had sat in storage since before my mother died. Every gear, every spring, every inch of the carved walnut frame had passed through my fingers. It was my peace offering. When I stepped into the ballroom, the noise hit me first. Laughter glasses clinking a jazz trio trying to be heard over the murmur of money. Richard stood in the center, flanked by his new wife, Marilyn, 40 years younger, and dressed in a gown that shimmered like wet glass. She noticed me before he did, and smiled that polite, poisonous smile reserved for people you wish hadn't shown up. "Sam," she sang. "You made it, I wouldn't miss it," I said, lying through my teeth. Richard turned. For a brief second, his eyes softened the way a wolf's might when it mistakes a hunter for prey. Then he smiled the smile that had closed more deals than I'd ever sign contracts. "My son, the carpenter," he announced loudly enough for the nearest tables to hear. The words dripped with performance. I handed him the gift. "I fixed the old clock," I said, "the one that used to sit in your study." He peeled away the paper like it was something unclean. For a moment, silence spread. The clock's pendulum swung slowly, ticking into the quiet. Then he laughed, a dry, cutting sound that froze the air. "You rebuilt a clock," he said, his tone turning sharp. "While your brother-in-law just closed a $20 million deal this morning. My God, Samuel, is this what you call achievement?" People stopped talking. Someone started recording, phones rising like a row of tiny black mirrors. "I didn't come here for that," I whispered. "But that's all you ever come with," he said, stepping closer. "Disappointment." And before I could move, his hand struck my face. A single deliberate crack that echoed through the ballroom like a judge's gavel. Gasps, flashes, whispers, Marilyn's phone already raised the crowd hungry for scandal. Then his voice loud, final. "You're no son of mine. From this moment, you're out of my will." I stood there, cheek-burning clock still ticking behind me, as if counting the seconds of my humiliation. Then I turned, walked past the cameras, through the glass doors, and into the storm waiting outside. Rain poured in sheets, cold and cleansing. By the time I reached my truck, my shirt clung to my skin, and saltwater rain or tears I couldn't tell blurred the road ahead. That night, driving home through the lightning, I realized something had broken for good. Not the bond between father and son, it turns out, that might never have existed, but the illusion that it ever could. The storm that night didn't end when I left the hotel, it followed me home. Rain hammered the windshield so hard the wipers could barely keep up, and every flash of lightning lit the highway like a crime scene photograph. My cheek still burned where his hand had landed, a red reminder of everything I'd lost in front of 300 strangers. By the time I reached my workshop in Charleston, the streets were rivers. The clock I'd restored for him was still in the back seat, wrapped in soaked paper, ticking faintly, a pulse that refused to die. I carried it inside, set it on the workbench, and just stared at it. The room smelled of wet wood and humiliation. I don't know how long I sat there, minutes, hours. The power flickered shadows bending across the walls like restless ghosts. Then, as I turned toward the door, a bolt of lightning illuminated something pale, wedged in the old metal mailbox beside the entrance. A piece of paper. At first, I thought it was another bill, maybe a condolence note from one of his friends. But when I opened the box, I found a soaked envelope, edges curling, ink bleeding like bruises. No return address, no stamp. Just 3 words written in black ink across the front. For Samuel. My pulse quickened. It wasn't uncommon for people to drop letters for me, clients, collectors, but this felt different. The paper was heavy, the kind used for court documents. Inside, wrapped in plastic to protect it from the rain, was an old photograph. A woman in a nurse's uniform sat in a hospital chair, cradling a newborn baby. The photo had aged the colors, soft and yellowed, but the image was sharp enough for me to see the woman's eyes glisten with tears. On the back, written in faint pencil, were 6 words. "He was never yours to take." My throat tightened. I flipped the picture over again, studying the background. The placard behind the bed read, "Savannah General Hospital, a 2-hour drive south." The date scrawled in the corner, March 1981. That was the year I was born. For a moment, I thought it was a cruel prank. Maybe someone from the party wanted to humiliate me further, feed the gossip cycle. But then I saw the signature at the bottom of the note. It was faint, blurred by rain, but I could still make out the name, Martha Klein. I knew that name. My mother, the woman I thought was my mother, had mentioned her once, years ago. Said she was a nurse who helped us during a difficult time. But when I'd asked what that meant, she changed the subject, her face pale as snow. Now, sitting alone in that storm-lit room, the clock ticking behind me like an accusation, I couldn't shake the feeling that this letter had been waiting years, maybe decades, for the right night to find me. I stared at the words again. He was never yours to take, and something cold slid down my spine. Maybe my father's slap wasn't just about anger. Maybe it was fear. Fear that someone someday would deliver this letter. And now that it was in my hands, I knew one thing for certain. The truth had finally found its way home. Sleep didn't come that night. Every time I closed my eyes, the image of that soaked photograph flashed behind my eyelids. The nurse's trembling smile, the baby's tiny hand curled like a question mark. By dawn, the storm had passed, but something inside me hadn't. The letter sat on the workbench beside the clock, its edges dry now, its message still wet in my mind. He was never yours to take. I needed answers, and the only person I could think of who might have them was Eleanor Hayes, our old neighbor from my childhood home on Beechwood Drive. She'd lived next door for nearly 40 years before moving into a retirement community on the outskirts of town. She'd been my mother's closest friend, the kind of woman who remembered everyone's birthdays and baked pies for funerals. If anyone had seen something back then, it would be her. Her place smelled like lavender and old paper. She answered the door in a cardigan the color of mint tea, her silver hair pulled back in a careful twist. "Samuel Whitaker," she said, studying me like a memory she wasn't sure was real. "You look just like her. Like my mother," I asked. Her lips thinned. "That's one way to put it. Come in, dear." We sat in her sunroom overlooking a courtyard of azaleas. The light was warm, but the air between us felt heavy, thick with the kind of silence that means someone has already decided whether or not to tell you the truth. I showed her the photograph. She held it for a long time, her hands trembling slightly. "I knew this day would come," she murmured. "I just hoped I'd be gone before it did." "What do you mean?" She looked up at me, and for the first time I saw real fear in her eyes. "Your mother, God rest her soul, wasn't pregnant the year you were born." Everyone noticed, of course. In Charleston, people always do. Then suddenly there you were. No one asked questions because, well, Richard had money, and money buys silence. Her words landed like stones. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. Eleanor continued, voice trembling. "There was talk of a fire that year down in Savannah. A hospital burned to the ground, Savannah General, I think. They said records were lost, babies displaced, but later I saw something I wasn't supposed to." She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "A man came to your house late one night carrying a black leather case. I saw Richard take it at the door. He didn't see me, but I remember that case. It had silver clasps, and he looked inside before closing it fast. After that, no one mentioned the hospital again. For a moment, all I could hear was the ticking of the wall clock behind her, echoing the one still sitting on my bench at home. "Eleanor," I said quietly, "if what you're saying is true, then who am I?" Her eyes softened, almost pitying. "That's the question, isn't it? But Samuel, sometimes the truth doesn't just set you free. It burns everything else down with it. When I left her house, the air outside felt too bright, too clean, like the world had just been scrubbed of lies, and I was standing in the rawness underneath. For the first time in my life, I wasn't sure if I wanted to know who I really was, or if I could survive it when I did." Eleanor's words followed me home like a shadow that had finally found its voice. By the time I reached Charleston, night had settled in, and the city lights reflected off puddles like fractured mirrors. I parked outside my workshop, but couldn't make myself go in. The truth was no longer hiding in whispers. It had a name, a face, and the shape of a black leather case. I spent the next morning sitting at my kitchen table with the letter, the photograph, and a list of questions that no son should ever have to ask. Then I did what desperate people do when they run out of answers. I hired someone to find them for me. His name was Frank Delaney, a retired private investigator who'd once worked missing persons cases for the Savannah Police Department. I found him through a friend of a friend. His office was a narrow room above a pawn shop walls, lined with old case files, the air thick with cigarette smoke and stale coffee. He looked like a man who'd seen too many truths and wished he hadn't. "You look like someone who's about to dig up a grave," he said, lighting another cigarette. "Maybe my own," I replied. I told him everything from the slap at the birthday party to the photograph and Eleanor's confession. He listened without interrupting, only nodding occasionally, his eyes narrowing when I mentioned Savannah General Hospital. "I remember that fire," he said finally. "Files went missing, adoption papers, birth records. Whole mess got buried in bureaucracy. You sure you want to open this? I don't have a choice anymore." He exhaled smoke toward the window. "All right, Mr. Whitaker. I'll see what's left of the ashes." 2 weeks passed before he called. His voice was calm, but there was something in it, a hesitation that made my stomach twist. "I think I found something you'll want to see," he said. "Come by." When I arrived, Frank had spread several yellowed documents across his desk. Newspaper clippings, police reports, a missing child bulletin dated May 1981. The headline read, "6-month-old vanishes from park in Georgia. Authorities suspect abduction." The name below it, Jacob Harlan. He handed me a photocopy of the police file. "DNA records didn't exist back then, but I ran your name through a genealogy site. The birth data doesn't match the Whitaker family. You were born 2 months earlier than your records say. Nobody ever checked that." My hands trembled. "So you're saying I'm saying there's a good chance you're Jacob Harlan? And the woman in that photo, Martha Klein, she was the nurse on duty the day he disappeared, still alive, living at a care facility near Jacksonville. I don't remember breathing for several seconds. The storm inside me returned. I need to see her." The next afternoon, I drove south. The nursing home sat beneath moss-covered oaks, the air heavy with disinfectant and the faint sweetness of lilies. I found her in a quiet room by the window, her hair thin and white, her eyes clouded but kind. When I showed her the photograph, her fingers trembled as she reached for mine. "I broke my oath for love," she whispered. "And that's how they stole you." From her bedside drawer, she pulled out a small silver bracelet, tarnished but intact, shaped like a swan in flight. "Your mother had the other one," she said softly. "She never stopped looking for you." I held the bracelet in my palm. It felt heavier than metal, like proof, like loss, like the first breath of a life I never knew was mine. The silver bracelet hadn't left my wrist since that day in Jacksonville. Every time the light caught its tiny swan engraving, I felt the weight of 2 lives pressing against my skin, the one I'd lived and the one stolen from me before I ever had a choice. For a week, I walked around in a daze, haunted by the nurse's trembling voice. I broke my oath for love. And that's how they stole you. I didn't know what to do with that kind of truth. It wasn't rage, I felt it was disorientation, like the floor of my life had quietly caved in, and no one else had noticed. Then 7 days later, the knock came. 3 precise raps on my workshop door, firm enough to make the dust shiver off the window pane. When I opened it, 3 strangers stood under the porch light umbrellas, glistening with rain. They looked like they'd stepped out of a corporate photograph, black suits, neutral expressions, and a kind of quiet authority that made the air around them heavy. "Mr. Whitaker," the woman in front asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. She was tall, mid-50s, maybe her silver-streaked hair pulled neatly into a bun. My name is Judith Banks. These are my colleagues Peter Doyle and Liam Rowe. We represent Mr. Jonathan Harlan. The name hit me before her words did. Harlan, the same name from the missing child file. Can we come in? She asked gently. We believe you're the person we've been searching for. Inside, I poured coffee with hands that barely listened to me. They declined politely, sitting straight-backed in the dim light of my workshop. The smell of varnish still in the air. Judith set a leather folder on my table and opened it. Mr. Harlan is the founder and CEO of Harlan Aerospace Technologies, she began. He's been searching for his kidnapped son for 42 years. 3 months ago, a DNA cross-match from a private ancestry database led us here. Peter slid a document toward me, an official lab report stamped in blue ink. My name, Samuel Richard Whitaker, stood beside another Jacob Jonathan Harlan. 99.8% probability. For a moment, all sound drained out of the room. The clock on the wall kept ticking, but everything else, the rain, the lawyers, even my own heartbeat, faded into a single suspended silence. Judith's voice broke through it. Mr. Harlan wanted you to hear this directly from us. He's known the truth for weeks. The FBI is already investigating Richard Whitaker and his wife Marilyn for child abduction and falsified adoption records. They are cooperating. For now. I sank into the nearest chair. The man who had humiliated me, who'd stripped me of a name and a will, might never have been my father at all, and the man I'd never met had spent decades trying to find me. Judith closed the folder softly. Your biological father would like to meet you when you're ready. You are his only living heir. His estate is currently valued at approximately $2.4 billion. It sounded obscene, almost cruel. I'd been disinherited from millions by a stranger who called himself my father, only to inherit billions from a man I couldn't remember. Before they left, Judith paused at the door. One more thing, she said. Mrs. Marilyn Whitaker has tried to contact you. She insists she has information you'll want to hear, something she claims is more dangerous than the kidnapping itself. And the door closed, and their car disappeared into the rain. I sat there alone, the bracelet cold against my wrist, the word heir echoing in my head like a verdict I wasn't sure I wanted to win. For days after the lawyers left, my workshop felt haunted. Not by ghosts, but by silence. Thick, watchful silence that waited for me to decide who I was now. Every sound seemed too sharp. The creak of the floorboards, the hum of the old clock, the faint rattle of rain against the windows. The word heir echoed through my head, but it didn't feel like victory. It felt like someone else's life being laid at my feet. Then the phone rang. A woman's voice, tight and shaking, Sam. It's Marilyn. For a moment, I didn't recognize it. What do you want? I asked. They're coming for Richard, she said. The FBI raided the office this morning. But there's something you don't understand. Something worse than the kidnapping. Her breath trembled through the receiver. I can't talk on the phone. Please. Come see me before it's too late. I found her later that afternoon in her penthouse overlooking the harbor, the same view my father, No Richard, used to brag about at dinner parties. She looked smaller without the cameras, her perfect hair undone, eyes red from crying. On the table sat a small steel safe, open, its contents spread like relics of a confession. Inside were documents, birth certificates, a hospital ID tag, faded photographs of a young woman holding a baby with my same gray eyes. And beneath them, a letter written in a woman's delicate hand, Elaine Harlan. My mother. Marilyn spoke quietly, her voice trembling between guilt and fear. I didn't know everything at first. He told me the fire was an accident. But later, I saw the payments. I saw the names. She slid a folder toward me. Inside were bank transfers, medical records, a list of infants taken from hospitals across Georgia and Florida during the early 80s. The same signature appeared on each Richard Whitaker. "The fire," I said, slowly staring at the papers. "Savannah General." She nodded. "It wasn't an accident. He paid to have the records destroyed. A staged electrical fault. 2 nurses died that night. It was the only way to erase what he'd done. By the time I left her apartment, the sun had dipped below the water, turning the sky into a smear of copper and smoke. I drove straight to the federal building where the FBI had taken Richard. They let me in on one condition: I didn't speak until the questioning was over. He sat behind the glass, older, somehow, the weight of exposure pressing into his shoulders. The man who once filled rooms with his voice now looked like a monument collapsing in slow motion. When the agents left, I stood in the doorway. He looked up, eyes dull. "They told you everything, didn't they?" I stepped closer, my voice steady but shaking underneath. "You didn't just steal a baby, Richard. You stole a life." For a long moment, he said nothing. Then quietly, tears slid down his cheeks, not from remorse, but from defeat. "I made you into something better," he muttered. "That's worth something." I stared at him through the glass. "No," I said. "It's worth nothing." When I walked out the hallway, lights flickered above me, humming softly like the remnants of a fire that refused to die. And for the first time in my life, I felt the heat of truth, and it burned exactly the way it should. 3 months later, Charleston felt like a ghost town I'd already buried. The streets, the smell of varnish, even the creak of the floorboards in my old workshop. Everything belonged to a man who no longer existed. The FBI trial had closed, the press had moved on, and Richard Whitaker's empire was being dismantled piece by piece. He'd built monuments out of lies. Now they were nothing but paperwork and dust. I wasn't Samuel Whitaker anymore. Not legally, not spiritually. The name still lingered on my tongue like an aftertaste, but it didn't belong to me now. The DNA results, the confession, the fire, it had all burned that name away. What was left was Jacob Jonathan Harlan. Savannah was quieter than I remembered. Spanish moss draped over oak branches like old memories refusing to fall. I rented a small brick building near the riverfront and reopened my workshop under a new sign, Harlan Restorations, rebuilding what was lost. The first time I turned the key and stepped inside, I could almost hear my mother's voice. The woman I'd never known but somehow felt tethered to. The scent of wood, the hum of the tools, the rhythm of sandpaper, everything familiar, yet transformed. My father, my real father, Jonathan Harlan, visited every few days, not with gifts or grand gestures, but with stories. Stories about Elaine, her laughter, her stubbornness, how she'd paint the nursery every spring, even after the doctors told her she couldn't have more children. He never mentioned money, never spoke of inheritance. Instead, he'd bring coffee and sit across from me, watching the sawdust settle between us like snow. One evening, he brought a small wooden box. "This was hers," he said. "She wanted you to have it if we ever found you." Inside was a folded letter and a photograph, the same woman from the picture I'd found months earlier, holding a baby with my eyes. Her handwriting curved across the page, soft but deliberate. "If you ever find your way home, remember what's built with love can't be stolen." I read it twice before the words began to blur. For the first time in my life, I cried without shame, not from loss, but from arrival. Later that week, I built a rocking chair out of white oak, the same kind that had lined the halls of Savannah General before it burned. I placed it in my father's sunroom facing the river. When he sat in it for the first time, he closed his eyes. hands resting on the armrests, as if the wood itself was a pulse, connecting him back to everything he'd lost. "This feels like her," he said quietly. I looked at him, then at the sunlight pooling across the floor, golden and forgiving. All my life, I'd been fixing broken things, believing it was the only way to matter. But standing there in that quiet house, filled with the scent of fresh-cut wood and redemption, I finally understood some things aren't meant to be repaired. They're meant to be reborn. I turned to my father and smiled. Turns out, I said, the man who fixes broken things finally fixed himself. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear from you. Tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and what part of this story spoke to you the most? Your thoughts mean more than you know. Don't forget to subscribe to Domestic Tragedy for more true emotional stories about love loss and the power of truth.